Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Tonight it is the 3rd of October. We are going to do a recap of the aftermath of the Battle of Vuhledar, looking at Ukrainian sources from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, getting their perspective on the way in which their unit has changed over the past 2 years, and in particular with the recent withdrawal from Vuhledar as the Russians captured it. There's also some extensions of the Russian capture of that town, which we're going to look at in a second, but we'll also discuss the situation around Kursk, where there is a really important advance that just occurred earlier today. We'll also look at Toretsk and zoom up northwards to Kharkiv and Kursk. Let's begin once again by looking at the southern Donetsk front, or you could call it now the Vuhledar direction. You could see that in yellow, I've confirmed that the entirety of Vuhledar and also some surrounding fields are under entirely Russian control. Here you can see the amounts of 2.8 square kilometers. You also have this Russian movement really beginning to branch out west of Vuhledar. And although the axis itself appears to be rather narrow, it is centered around this Pivdonbaskaya coal mine. And simply the Ukrainians don't have many strong positions or troops that are located on either flank. Most of the forces that remain here, the forward squads, are either located near this horizontal trench line or in the basements of Vuhledar itself. You don't have that many. They're actually, making these forays out into the open in the fields. Whenever they do that, they are just rained upon heavily with artillery and drones. The Russians have a significant artillery advantage over here. The 72nd Brigade, I used to really hail their artillery garrison because it was very strong. And also, whenever they did get rations, they were very accurate and used it in an effective manner. But at this point, 2 years into the battle, and with not that many shipments coming in recent months, their stockpile has really dwindled. They're not able to conduct the same sort of large-scale artillery barrages to target various Russian columns or troops that advance from villages and also through open fields. They've really shifted towards reliance on drones, and that's why there are all these different groups like the Thermite group or the Totem group that are associated with this unit that publish a lot of the FPV strikes, but we don't see as much artillery coming out nowadays. And so the Russian forces do have the ability to branch out through these open fields relatively uncontested and take over a lot of the hinterlands, which does include paved routes that you see marked over here with the gray lines, and also various structures. So you can see here the Russians are rather close to taking over these, houses and agricultural facilities, and those will serve as future stepping stones as the Russians are now continuing to press on because they have not suffered significant losses in this round of fighting. You could say that throughout the entire course of the Battle of Vuhledar, they suffered very heavy losses, but then you're going into the past a year and a half ago. That doesn't have much relevance to now. At this point in time, the current grouping of elements of 5 or 6 brigades that were involved with the capture of Vuhledar, and then the branching out near Vuhledar to the west Prechestivka, they did not engage in dense urban combat. They were able to, in the span of 4 days, really quash the resistance here and force a Ukrainian retreat. And so now they're just continuing onwards to Vuhledar, as we said. Here you can see this is from the 72nd Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto 2 abandoned Russian vehicles on October 3rd. This also indicates an advance along a local ravine, which has a route leading directly into the southern part of Vuhledar. So the Russian armored columns are making use of these paved routes. And also remember, the entrance into the village is located on rather low elevation. Now the Russians are going to have Vuhledar, so they're going to utilize it to just completely dominate the entrance that you can see here in X. And that could also be turned to the west a little bit and utilized on Ukrainka, given the fact that in some of these fields, they are in rather low elevation. Others are in higher elevation. For instance, this X over here that you see northeast of Vuhledar, and also certain portions of this X here south of the village. So it's not entirely a crisis, but then remember, the Ukrainians don't have really any static positions left where I marked those X's. Any troop accumulations are in marked trenches or very, very close to the actual population clusters. Now, in regards to the end of the battle, what's being reported by Volodymyr Boyko, who, again, I want to make sure that I'm taking from Ukrainian sources that are legitimate. And so he does have a relatively large following on Facebook, and he just appears to be some professional who has some connection within this unit and the people that are fighting in the battle here. And he was also a member of the Aspen Institute in Kiev, so probably does have some sort of knowledge of this region. He said that during the final rotation that occurred in Vuhledar that was supposed to send in the additional reinforcements just to hold the line, to allow for perhaps a further holding on or withdrawal, depending on the perspective. Those 50 men, because 50 men were sent in from the 72nd Brigade as a final batch to hold on. Of them, only 4 were actually able to make it to Vuhledar itself and stay there for several days, because after the first day of sending in the reinforcements from Bohoyevlenka, about 30 of them were rendered unfit to serve in frontline combat. They were sent back to rear units and to hospitals, either because of some sort of sickness or just generally being beleaguered, because we're talking about men that were between the ages of 52 and 56. So that's the cohort you're discussing here for reinforcements, really scraping the bottom of the barrel to be sent in. So then you had the other 20 make it into Vuhledar. About 16 of them deserted. The other 4 actually made it in and were engaged in fighting before also deserting with the rest of the 72nd Brigade. Over the past week, the unit has unofficially begun withdrawing. They did not receive orders from the higher-ups. Now what's being said is that the Hortitsia Operational Strategic Grouping, that's sort of the general Ukrainian command structure within this part of Donetsk, they're saying that they gave the order to withdraw. But based on the accounts from the soldiers, they withdrew before any such announcement was given. And the announcement really was made once everybody was already out, either alive or dead. So due to the actual withdrawal not being organized, everybody tried to do it on foot. There were some killed and wounded in Vuhledar itself that needed to be rescued. They were not able to be taken out because you need to utilize vehicles. There had to be like these exfil operations from the north. Once the Ukrainians actually tried to take those people out, their vehicles were damaged, and so they just stopped attempting to do so. So any corpses or wounded individuals that were there, they were not able to get extracted. So they're now going to be in Russian hands. And then you have potentially a battalion's worth of Ukrainian soldiers, and we're going to get to the size of a battalion in this unit in a second, actually withdrawing on foot through what spans several kilometers northwards to safety. So during that time period, they were just pummeled with artillery FPVs, 7 kilometers. And so they took heavy losses, both killed and wounded, during that withdrawal. What's being mentioned by a Ukrainian within one of the battalions of this brigade within their headquarters, the battalion headquarters, is that a huge amount of the unit structure has been fatigued over these 2 years, understandably, to the extent that they really have been rendered ineffective in comparison to what it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, when they were just sent into the battles here, they were in full strength, even though they had engaged in the Battle of Kiev, of course. And so they were well equipped, well trained, and really full strength. But in the 2 years since then, only once has there been an incident where a company within this individual's battalion was at full strength. So all the other companies at all other periods of time throughout these 2 years, they never had the full capacity needed for a company really filled on paper. Every 3 months, they received 25 additional recruits to this battalion, and they were men over the age of 50. Very little experience, little knowledge in medical sort of etiquette, grenade launchers, machine guns, just total lack of understanding. And they didn't receive the proper training before being assigned to their units and sent to the rear bases. And so they had about a week to get trained by the seasoned professionals within the military there. And of course, 1 week to get accustomed to this sort of high intensity fighting is nowhere near enough. And so they were moved in without the proper training. What this source said is that his unit consists currently of 350 men, and that they could only fill platoons or even one singular platoon at maximum to 30 men. And then when you subtract the mechanics, the cooks, the drivers, then an actual infantry battalion spans from 14 to 18 people. And again, when you're thinking about platoons, they should be upwards of 50 men. So it's more than less than half of what it really should be. Also, the 350 number really is jarring, but perhaps there is a rationalization for it. So you'd expect in a normal Ukrainian infantry battalion to amount to perhaps 800 men or upwards of 1,000 pre-war, with the smaller core of the military before all these mobilizations. But now you have so many different battalions attached to this 72nd Brigade. You have actually 5 battalions. I think 3 of them maybe mechanized and 2 of them rifle. And then you have 2 other just independent battalions that are attached, and some of them are motorized. And then you also have these smaller drone companies and such. And so perhaps the manpower here has become so dispersed that each battalion is actually a company in essence. So the 350 number, it could be on the higher end for a specific battalion size, and that's probably tantamount 350 men to 2 companies, and definitely not a full strength battalion. So if that's the case with all the other battalions that are located within this unit, then it could add up, you could say, to 2,000, 3,000, but then that really rests upon sort of the 2 assumptions. First of all, that militaryland.net, which is the website that I'm getting the information from about the battalions for this unit, that they're being completely accurate with the number of battalions attached to this unit. And 2, that the other battalions in the unit haven't suffered even larger losses, which would mean they have less than 350 men. I'm just saying that hearing that number is just really surprising given the on-paper strength that a Ukrainian battalion should have. It's way less than what you'd expect. Now, to move to the northeast here in Kurakhove, Ukrainian sources mentioned repelling several Russian armored assaults south of Kurakhove. Clearly, they're making an effort here to expand control, and they've sensed a really good route of entrance, and they're very close to actually getting in. You could see that over here with this X. You could also see that all of the hinterland south of Konstantinivka are now coming under Russian control. Simply no feasible way for the Ukrainians to hold on over there. So it's 9.4 square kilometers as the Russians consolidate control over this southern vector before making the actual assault from that flank. Now, to go northwards here, you can see a really important Russian advance west of Hostre. At this point, I really should just mark all of Hostre as under Russian control, given where the geolocation actually is. Also, we know for sure the penal colony was used as a forward operating base for this assault. So in essence, you had a large Russian column, tanks, MCLBs, the usual assortment of tanks and vehicles mounted with infantry. They probably came in through this route here, next, just north of Maximilianivka, took a west turn through the windbreaks in the rail line, made it all the way to the easternmost approaches of Ostrivska before then being met with really hard resistance from the 46th Airborne Brigade. So FPV strikes and artillery being rained down on them. We don't know if they have been able to establish a solid base of operation in Ostrivska, but it is a very small village. And at this point, given how close the Russians are to the Vovcha River, any sort of, transport across this eastern bank is not possible anymore. It has to be done by Ukrainian forces crossing over this part of the bridgehead and then going to Vovchenka and then crossing into Ostrivska. And even then, that's rather difficult to do because you're still rather close to the front line and there aren't many crossings right now. And the crossings that are here are very close to where the Russians are located. So the most secure route to supply the Ukrainians defending here that really are cornered by the river would be through Kurakhove. You have this one route leading into it. So that's being done at the moment. Ukrainians really do need to hold on and repel this attack in order to maintain control of this glue that connects the northern bridgehead in Kurakhove, this glue which prevents a flanking operation onto the city and also prevents crossings over the river into the southern flank of villages like Vovchenka and Kurakhove or Kurakhivka. They're definitely not ready for a new axis of attack from a totally different flank to be on the agenda for them. So the actual gain could be more than what I'm iterating here of 1 square kilometer because it could include this area that I'm marking in X. Also, it may include Maximilianivka. It appears the Russians have been able to recently expand control in this region. There's a video of Russian infantry pushing through this eastern portion in areas that I had previously marked as under Russian control. I think it's from just today, actually. And it shows a Russian forward squad killing 2 Ukrainian soldiers from the 46th Brigade. So clearly there is some sort of back and forth fighting throughout these houses. And the battalions that are defending here are making a serious effort to drag it out, lest the Russians then use them as forward operating bases for using paved roads, of course, to push northwards like we saw. And then worst case scenario, westwards into Kurakhove. We don't know how the trenches will fare. There's a lot of question marks as to the efficacy of the Kurakhove trenches, which we're going to see answered very soon. Now, zooming in on Tsukuryne, you could see Russian advances, including full capture of the St. Basil mine and the 105th mine. So this large facility over here, right next to the windbreaks, gives Russians very good sort of vantage points to overlook Izmailivka, Novoselivka, and a lot of these regions that you see here, including Kiernik, are on very high elevation. So it's not to take away from the Ukrainian local defense, but having a man-made structure usually does dominate above all of those hills and gives just a perfect branch to expand from. So just to look at the extent of the gain, it amounts to 0.6 square kilometers. And then Tsukuryne, you can see how it's being squeezed by the Russians in a very similar fashion to what Russians have done in many similar sized villages by advancing along the flanks, taking control over forested regions to the north and the south, instead of just going in heads first. Now the Russians, after degrading the Ukrainian defense here to a strong enough degree, they feel comfortable actually infiltrating. So you can see the videos from September 30th of the initial foray into southern Tsukuryne. Now you have an even larger advance that has almost reached the rail line here. You could also see Russian advance of 1.9 square kilometers to the northeast of Tsukuryne, further strengthening the northern flank, which was secured by Russian armored forces dismounting troops over here, marked in X. The Ukrainians are well aware of these flanking operations, and their goal right now is to relieve pressure on the flanks. And they can't really expel the Russians from the village itself. They're just trying to hold on to it and drag out the fighting. But the tankers from the 59th Brigade, they were sent in to conduct localized counterattacks. You can see that over here. October 2nd, 59th Brigade, they fired at a Russian fort position in a tree line. So the Russians had actually expanded even further than the mines over here. And now, if we're measuring it, they're very, very close to this paved road that connects to Novoselivka 2 kilometers southwards. So you can see that the tankers were sent in to very, very crucially create a stopgap, preventing any future breakthrough in the region. Also to the north, you had the tank battalion of the 59th Brigade engaged in firing towards the Russian forward positions. So they fired here at the windbreak 6 times, where the Russian troops dismounted. And that's a part of preventing the northern flank from breaking through, because this northern flank, besides from being a threat to Tsukuryne, there aren't that many other organized settlements nearby. So you could have a scenario that would really be dangerous, where they threaten these horizontal defenses. Could go south to Kremina Balka, for instance, but also to expand much further westwards to like Novodmitrivka. And this would already be an issue in relation to Ukraine's rear health. Now, in regards to Kharkiv, this is also a concerning development. The fact that there are reports from Russian sources of infiltrations into Izmailivka. This would be a western flanking operation. At the same time, there is information about the Russians' DRGs entering into northern Kharkiv, but nothing verified as of now. But you could see how a combined effort onto Izmailivka and Novoselivka would pose a huge threat to the future logistics and future connection of the broader Ukrainian base in Donetsk to Kharkiv and other villages themselves, because the capture of Novoselivka would take over a key paved route, one of the only ones left that actually reaches Kharkiv, and it would also mean that there's only 6 kilometers between the reservoir and the front line. So I think the Russians really are going to try to capitalize on that, as opposed to just advancing head on into Kharkiv itself, when there is a really good opportunity now to create a big weakness for the remaining base that is located within this red rectangle. Additionally, you have this small advance, perhaps conducted by the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade in eastern Lysivka. We're going to zoom in and see the video itself. It's from the 25th Airborne Brigade. They just released a ton of footage of grenade drops and FPV strikes onto vehicles and onto troops that are dismounting from them and operating in tree lines, making it all the way to Lysivka. So some of them were, of course, struck on the process. Then the ones that made it to Lysivka, they set camp in this eastern approach, and that's when they were bombarded and dropped with grenades, leading to casualties. And it's a relatively open area. It's a small village. A lot of the houses themselves were targeted as well, and so that invariably leads to losses, but it also implies that the Russians have been able to infiltrate into the settlement itself. Now, looking at New York and Toretsk, the 12th Azov National Guard Brigade, they released this important video. I think it's 1 hour long, just compilation of repelling a large-scale Russian breakthrough that was attempted and was largely repelled northwest of New York in the direction of Nelipivka and Leonidivka. The actual incident occurred on September 21st, and so the footage is now only now it's being released with this high resolution. And so these geolocations don't have that much significance for events going on 2 weeks later. But I'm just going to say that since then, we haven't seen any additional footage to clarify what's going on with this corridor here that you see marked with the red rectangle. We don't know if the Ukrainians' ground forces were able to go in afterwards and take back the positions that were taken over by those Russian vehicles, or if the Russians since then conducted additional attacks. So the last we heard is that the Russians were infiltrating into Leonidivka 2 weeks ago. But if the situation has not been updated ever since, then it does imply that they were eventually pushed back and that the front line is probably closer to being around here. I just can't verify one way or another. And we do, of course, have the vehicular losses recorded by the 12th Brigade. You have 2 BMPs destroyed over here near Lipivka, one by artillery, one by another Ukrainian tank, I believe. And there's some other footage from this region just showing the damage that was done by the Azov Brigade. Azov Brigade, I would say that it's probably better staffed than a lot of these other units that you see here because they were only recently moved in from a part of the front line that saw much less fighting around Luhansk. And then also they have a stronger component when it comes to tanks and artillery and all that. So that's a part of just the thinking of why they were moved in and are now heavily engaged in fighting. To zoom in into Toretsk, this is where the Russians have been able to advance. You could see slight advance reported by deep states. There are a lot of firefights going on in the center of Toretsk. This is the full focus of the Russian side because they know that if they take over this region, then everything else will fall from there. Everything will come into play. And the Ukrainians that are remaining in frontline positions that protrude, they will be very, very compromised and very overlooked by the Russians taking over that center. So they're not even focusing on that right now. They're only looking at advancing through the central area. And there's a lot of drone battles going on back and forth. There's some footage here. I want to see if this is recent. September 30th. This is from the 4th Guard Battalion, which is a part of the 101st Protection Brigade, which I believe protected the Kiev region. And so they have a detachment also defending in Vovchansk area, and another battalion here conducting FPV strikes onto the Russian forces during their advances. Now to look at the Siversk front here, we do have an interesting advance. We're going to zoom in. First one is north of Vesele. This is a video. Let's see the actual date of it. It occurred October 2nd. After dismounting troops, this Russian vehicle was destroyed by mines and FPVs. This incident was observed by the 3rd Battalion of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, one of the main units involved with the long-standing defense of this salient. You could see just a very slight advance, but it is a part of the Russians shaping the battlefield, advancing from one tree line to another. The larger scale advances then occurred north of Tsukuryne and also perhaps in Vuhledar, because the Russian MOD, they claim to have taken over the village in its entirety, which would imply a really large protruding advance that you see marked over here. I mean, it's possible. It's just something that we don't have proof for coming out yet. So we'll wait what goes on over the next few days. We do have proof of Russian advances going on southwards, though, branching out of Tsukuryne and Ivano-Darivka. So you could see an advance amounting to 4.1 square kilometers. And you know this based on the 3rd Svoboda Battalion, Victory Battalion of the 4th Brigade. They had Dragon Drone spraying molten thermites onto a really long tree line, an area which I couldn't see any troops within it, but definitely it implies that the Ukrainians know the Russians are using it, and they want to hinder their ability to hide under the foliage and, of course, utilize that for their own purpose of advancing westwards towards areas like Vuhledar, because the fall of such a village would really be huge, because then you'd have this access to a paved route leading directly into Siversk. You already have all the chips sort of falling in that direction with very strong Russian push that occurred several months ago around Rozdolivka and the fields to the south of Siversk. You have the push along the rail line. You have the push from Ivano-Darivka and the yellow over here, and then also another one from Vuhledar. It would just be a huge amount of pressure coming in, sometimes from higher elevated areas, onto one fortified city, and it's been able to hold out for a very, very long time. And it's really a way to gauge the health of the Ukrainian defenses in a way is by looking at whether the Siversk front rapidly declines or whether it's able to stabilize, because this is really the pinnacle of Ukrainian defensive excellence. So if here there are some sort of issues, which could be down to, of course, attrition rates over time and also movement of forces, it then does imply that everything and other parts of the front line is going on at a larger degree if it's a more intense area. Now looking at Kharkiv, here you have Ukrainian sources claiming Russian capture of this 2 square kilometer piece of land. This is really, really close to Krukhakivka, close, what is Kolesnikivka, really close to these villages on the Oskil River bank. Also, you have this bridge here between Senkove and the other side, which the Russians are close to cutting off. So this is the closest it's ever been with the Russian severing connection between the northern part of the Oskil River, which is an area with Kupiansk, so there is an entirely independent large garrison over there, and then further south, this much more spread out region, a lot of it rural in nature, hills, some trench lines that could be formidable defenses, but again, until you reach them, it's pretty deep into the front line. So it's a lot of territory that could be ceded and taken over by the Russians in the future. And this sort of area connects all the way to Izium to the south, if you were to go even southwestwards, you could say. And so this would be a severing of the Ukrainian connection here and basically open it up to totally two different operational realities, which the Russians can, of course, take advantage of, advancing both northwards and southwards through higher elevated areas and open up new flanking operations that definitely the Ukrainian garrisons here are not prepared for, as most of their resources were poured into holding on front line directly eastwards, which they've done, but we don't know what's going on yet with the flanks, north or south, because we see that they were unable to deal with the Pischane breakout and the blooming that has occurred ever since. And finally, just to look at the Glushkovo district in Kursk, there is one video released recently from this area which requires my attention. Here it is from, let's see what pops up, October 2nd. This is from the Pentagon Unit FPV element in the 225th Assault Battalion, one of the main units involved with the Ukrainian advances here. They destroyed a Russian BMD-2 that was counterattacking southeast of Veseloy. This is very recent, and it does indicate that there is still a Russian presence very close to the village, that there is no Ukrainian breakout in the direction of Glushkovo at this moment or in fields nearby. It puts the line of contact roughly over here. I'm going to change the map if there is additional proof, but for now I'm going to leave all of the perimeter of Veseloy a gray zone, and it appears that the Ukrainians for now have been contained to this specific region by the 155th Marine Brigade. And then a bit to the east over here near Obuchovka, this is an admission of earlier advances by the Russian forces that Deep State is now mentioning on all of Obuchovka, including the eastern outskirts and fields southwards, are taken over by them. And that is an area amounting to 3.5 square kilometers. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.